Thank you, Jeff. Well, what I'd like to do now is we have a mic. Someone else a shot here?
Hi, Mike Lounge, the Boeing Company. I want to talk about a barrier to selling commercial services to NASA. I've had some experience at that. So imagine you finally got your project sold to NASA. They put together a plan and a contract opportunity that buys enough stuff for you to justify the investment. And you go to your investors, whether they're venture capitalists or banks with project finance or internal treasury. And when you're bringing NASA along as your anchor customer, NASA is not a very attractive customer. And there are two problems, and I'm wondering, this is really for Jeff or Chan, if there's any thinking on addressing these. One is the lack of multi-year appropriations, the lack of the ability to firmly commit to amount of funding that requires more than 1 year, and the other is termination liability, so that the offerer is at least made whole upon termination for convenience by the government. Those are fundamental showstoppers.
In terms of, your first suggestion in terms of a multi-year appropriations, frankly, just to be perfectly honest, I see that as a very extremely difficult, if not impossible prospect, not from necessarily, where we sit as authorizers, but just what I know about appropriators. That's virtually a non-starter. I just don't really see how that's going to, get, I'm not even sure how they're even willing to entertain, that conversation. So that's going to be a very difficult, path to pursue.
Well, the other thing is, it's, no Congress can bind a future Congress. That's a sort of a cardinal rule. But the issue that I mentioned earlier about this budget-driven policy, I think, is relevant to that. If we have a consensus on policy that drives, and there's a consensus on that, then there's continuity. And the proof is that last picture that Frank showed of the space station. We went through 22 different votes to try to kill that in the Congress. It survived, and because there was a consensus built about what we were trying to do there, and that proves that you can have multi-year funding consistency. Now, did it take us 5 to 10 extra years, even without Columbia, to get it built because of lack of adequate funding? Yes, and so we increased our total cost. But I don't know that there is an answer to the systematic problem you're raising. We certainly. If you've got some language that you want to put in the bill, we'd look at it. But we have a hard time getting the House to agree to anything more than a 2-year authorization bill, let alone. And we always start with 3 at least every time we have the last 5 years. So there's a lot of difficulty. People want to keep the options open, but if there's a national consensus, then I think that's the best hope.
So for the appropriations, my first experience in commercial space was with Space Hab about 15 years ago, I guess. And we had an insurance policy for failure of the government to appropriate. And we actually collected on it. So one company one time wrote that policy. I doubt if it would happen again.
Well, I think it's something we ought to look into. So give me some language.
Well, I think if I could just build on what Jeff was saying, the Anti-Deficiency Act, obviously, like Jeff was saying, you can't, one Congress can't, commit a future Congress in spending. But that's something that's unique about COTS is these service-based contracts with their milestone structure agreements is a.
Since you made me carry the microphone, I'm going to ask a question.
Maybe you should give it to Phil right there. So
you wish. And actually, I'm going to ask 2 questions. I have one for Chan and one for Jeff. My boss, Mr. Bigelow, says that America reacts very well to crisis, but very poorly to incremental change. Pearl Harbor we can respond to. slow progress, we're in trouble. And I think it's interesting that prior to China putting a man in space, we all said, well, if China ever puts someone in orbit, that's when we'll wake up. You'll see a strong reaction on the Hill. Well, China put someone in space and nothing. Apathy. Then, we say, well, maybe when China puts up a space station, then we'll react. I guarantee we will reach the point that China will put a space station up of their own, and we will still do nothing. And then I think we'll come to the time that Jeff describes, when China goes and removes the U.S. flag from the moon and says, we don't need it anymore, and then it will be too late for us to respond. And to be clear, I am not against working with China. Listen, they're going with or without us. I think we should involve them in our programs and involve us with ISS. In terms of the Russians, you know how I feel about that. I'd much rather have my son grow up in a world where I'm buying their rockets versus them pointing at us. So I hear all these great things from Chan and Jeff. And this is my first question to Chan. The distance between here to the moon is nothing compared to the distance between what I hear from you and what I hear from appropriators. And what can you do to help bridge that gap as authorizers with your brethren on the Appropriations Committee so that they recognize the things that you're saying and act accordingly? And if we wanted to get to specifics about that $150 million that we're looking at right now, I assume both of you are in favor of that. For COTS, what can you do to convince the appropriators? With Jeff, I had a second question, and to give credit where credit is due, that furry mammal phrase was coined by Natasha Loder, who's the enterprising reporter for The Economist, when she wrote a story about the success of Bigelow Aerospace in the ITAR front. She called us furry mammals. And Jeff, I don't want to disagree with you because I'm a furry mammal and you're a woolly mammoth. You'll step on me. But I thought it was very interesting at the Augustine Commission yesterday that you saw Senator Nelson come in and basically tell the commission to ignore the budgets, just like you were describing, that they should not be confined by that. Then at the end of the meeting, you had the public. Joe Sixpack came in and said just the opposite, that you, NASA, need to be realistic about what's going to happen, work within the existing budget, try and stay low. And I guess my question to you, Jeff, and this is something I struggle with myself, should we stick to our guns, particularly as an authorizer and NASA as a program, and do something big that we want, and then have the appropriations not manifest? Are we better off in that situation, sticking to our guns, or are we better off creating a new paradigm where we lower the bar and try and work within what we expect to have? And I think that's the question that we face, that the Augustine panel will face, and I'm interested to hear both of your responses to that.
Yeah, I've seen that dichotomy in terms of viewpoints from Joe Sixpack. But remember, Joe Sixpack believes that NASA's budget is at least $125 billion a year or more. Joe Sixpack doesn't understand that we're, less than 0.5% of the national budget. My 20-year-old son the other day, I took him down to see the launch last weekend. It didn't go, but we did take a tour of the Kennedy Space Center, and he was very impressed. And he said the other night, man, I can see why people would think, though, we ought to spend money somewhere else because all this stuff's so expensive. I mean, this is my own flesh and blood, I'm going to do a genetic test here and make sure he's really mine. But I said, look, and I told him that. He said, really? Well, then I withdraw my previous statement, But, and I said, another example, I said, look, NASA spending power today is the same as it was in 1990 in terms of constant dollars. That's the spending power of this agency today. Food stamps this year, three times the entire NASA budget. That doesn't say anything about food stamps negatively. It's just the degree to which we do what we can do with what we do with the amount of money we get is an eye-opener to people. So I don't really take that too seriously, except as a challenge to make them understand. And again, this point I made earlier, basically on your question, is that they have them look. One time, Senator Garn and I were talking about doing a bill that would require the NASA meatball logo be put on every piece of equipment that was derived in any way from a NASA-related technology development. And we didn't have CBO then. We had Library of Congress used to do those things back in those days. Anyway, they came back and said it would cost too much for industry to have to go back and do that because it would be everywhere, And that's the thing. People don't make the connection.